I thought I'd start by centering us back in the present day after Greg's catastrophe kind of stories, and remind us of what has happened to the ozone hole, and then talk about what we expect to happen in the future and how that will interact with climate change and its effect on the climate. So here we're looking at the ozone hole over Antarctica, and this is a plot similar to what Paul had shown of the ozone measurements over the last, I think it starts in 1960 up to 2010, up to present day. And they're measurements from both Antarctic stations and satellites. And you can see really in the huge drop-off in 1980 of the ozone levels down to present day, and our hope that it's now stabilising and starting to recover. And so over Antarctica itself, there's been a depletion of more than 50% of the ozone levels. And that's been predominantly in the spring months, where the conditions of both having sunlight and the climate conditions are conducive to ozone depletion. And because of the mechanisms involved, this doesn't really have an impact on our surface climate until the summer months. So we have the ozone hole in the spring months, but it comes down and interacts with our climate in the summer at the surface. And as Paul said, we do expect that the ozone hole will recover. All of the chemistry climate models that Greg talked about, when they put in the projections for the ozone depleting substance into the future, the ozone hole recovers back to 1980 levels by about mid-century, and then full recovery beyond that. And just to sort of state that I'm talking about the impact of the ozone hole on climate. And while the ozone depleting substances themselves, we've heard, could have had and do have a huge effect on their global warming potential, the actual hole itself, the fact that we've got this big hole in the sky, doesn't actually affect our global temperatures very much. It's a really localised effect, and the stratospheric ozone depletion only has a really minor impact on global surface temperatures. And in fact, until about a decade ago, climate scientists didn't really think the ozone hole itself would have much of an effect on climate at all. It was thought that it were two separate problems, climate change and the ozone hole. But a decade ago, we discovered otherwise. And the way that the ozone hole affects climate is actually through changing the atmospheric circulation. So here we have just a schematic of the atmosphere. So think of this as a slice through the atmosphere. We've got the surface at the bottom and the top of the atmosphere at the top. So we're slicing it from the equator down through Canberra and then to the South Pole. And in this atmospheric slice, we have the tropopause, which is the layer between the boundary between the troposphere, where all the weather occurs, and the stratosphere, where the ozone depletion occurs. And you can see that the tropopause is higher in the tropics, where the air is warmer, and lower in the polar regions. And ozone depletion cools the stratosphere over the Antarctic region, high up in the atmosphere, and that causes the tropopause to lift, and that then has an effect on the atmospheric circulations. So we have here two atmospheric circulations that we tend to think about as climate scientists. The Hadley cell, which is driven by rising warm air in the tropics, rising up to the top of the troposphere and then sinking in the subtropics, which causes, this sinking motion causes dry regions in the subtropics, so like the interior of Australia. And then we have this westerly jet, which is this really strong winds over the southern oceans that sort of go around the Antarctic continent, and so they're centred at around 50 south in latitude. So the effect of ozone depletion, which cools the stratosphere, changes this gradient of temperature between the equator and the poles and tends to shift these atmospheric circulations poleward. So these atmospheric circulations are really tied to our rainfall patterns. So you can see this sort of rain at the surface will shift poleward due to ozone depletion. And that sort of drives our storm systems away from Australia and also expands the Hadley cell further, expands that dry zone further poleward as well. And it's pretty hard to measure this westerly jet. It's centred over the Southern Ocean, but there are a few islands and there's satellite data. And recent research suggests that this jet has moved forward by about 2 degrees latitude since 1979. So there's evidence that this mechanism is in place. So because we don't have a lot of measurements of the winds, we can use another proxy for the strength and position of the winds, and we call it the Southern Annular Mode Index. And it's based on pressures, which we have a lot longer time series of over Antarctica and over mid-latitude stations. So we can define this SAM index and use it as a way of seeing how the ozone hole has affected climate. So here I'm showing the Southern Annular Mode Index from a chemistry climate model that has been driven by ozone depleting substances. So as you can see in the black line, the SAM index is increasing up to, from the 1970s up to present day. So the ozone depleting substances really drive a strong trend in the Southern Annular Mode. That's a shift in the storms and the westerly jet poleward. And it's very consistent with what's happened. We've had this strong shift in the observations. And it's to all, most of the research suggests that shift in the SAM has been driven primarily by ozone depletion. You can also see in the dotted line is the time series of the SAM in winter, and there's just really no role for ozone in that season. So ozone really only affects our climate at the surface in the summer months. And in the future, which I'll touch on a bit later, the ozone hole is projected to recover and the SAM index sort of comes back down to where we are now. So how does the ozone hole impact our climate? Well, here we're showing changes in surface temperature and winds with a positive SAM, which is our proxy for ozone depletion. So when we've had ozone depletion, positive SAM, we've had this real strengthening in winds going around the Antarctic continent. So it's really sped up the winds close to Antarctica and shifted them closer to the Antarctic continent. And this drives cooling over the Antarctic stations, as you can see in the blue dots. The increase in the winds causes warming over the Antarctic Peninsula and the southern tip of South America. And then in the right panel is the changes in winds and sea surface temperatures, so the temperatures of the ocean surface. So again, you can see the increase in the winds close to Antarctica, decrease of the winds over Australia and New Zealand latitudes. And that increase in the winds over the Southern Ocean sort of drives cool, deep water up and causes cooling at the surface. And that's important because that cool, deep water is also carbon rich. And so as you upwell that water due to the increase in the winds, you really can limit the carbon uptake by the Southern Ocean. And so that's an important point for going forward. And there's also implications for Antarctic sea ice and ice sheets potentially. A bit closer to home, the impacts on the surface climate. Again, I'm only focusing on summer when ozone depletion plays a role. You can see here again the impacts of the Southern Annular Mode, or our proxy for ozone depletion, on New Zealand temperatures, rainfall and southern Australian rainfall. So as I was showing before, the winds over the mid-latitude regions, they weaken when we have, due to ozone depletion, so the storms kind of move away. And that causes more stable climate over New Zealand, so you get warming temperatures. And it also decreases the westerly winds on the west coast of New Zealand, and that causes less stormy weather, so drying over the west coast of New Zealand. You also get some increase in the rainfall on the east coast of New Zealand due to sort of upslope effects of decreasing, or the winds there. In southern Australia, it's a similar thing. We decrease the westerly winds and even actually turn to easterly, have more easterly winds over the southeast of Australia, and that causes increase in rainfall there. So the impact of ozone depletion is to have sort of wetter and cooler summers than we had before. And a recent study showed that these impacts, down to the rainfall changes due to the ozone depletion, can be captured by climate models. And this is a really great result, that the models are sophisticated enough to take these ozone-depleting substances and look at all the dynamics of the atmosphere and get a similar response to what we would have expected theoretically. So in this slide, I'm showing at the top the change in the observed precipitation over summer or the change in rainfall from 1979 to 2000, and that period was chosen because the model simulations were available for that period as well. So in the observations, you'll see in summer we have indeed had slightly wetter conditions over Australia, drier conditions over New Zealand, as I'd just shown in the previous plot. There's also changes in the tropics that have happened as well over the last 20 years or so. And in the bottom, I'm showing a coupled chemistry climate model. It's a Canadian model. And this was the first model that actually had the chemistry and climate and ocean and everything involved in the experiment. And so it was a really sophisticated model that took many years, as Greg suggested. These models are really expensive to run and take a long time. But you can see that the climate model captures, when it's just driven by ozone depletion, it captures similar patterns in the subtropics and the extratropics as have occurred in the observations. So we get wetter conditions in the southeast of Australia, drier conditions over New Zealand and those mid-latitude regions. So what about the future? So back to my little cartoon, I can show that ozone depletion cools the stratosphere and it shifts these atmospheric circulations poleward and takes the storms further south. But in the future, we're expecting and hoping that the ozone hole will recover, and that'll have basically the exact opposite effect. We have warming in the polar stratosphere over Antarctica, and that changes the temperature gradient between the equator and the pole, and that has the effect of moving the storm systems back further closer to the equator. However, ozone is not happening on its own, and the world is complicated. So going forward, we're expecting that greenhouse gases will increase as well. And so that complicates the picture because greenhouse gases have the same impact as ozone depletion. So greenhouse gases warm the tropics more than the polar regions, so they really lift the tropopause in the tropics. That steepens the gradient of temperatures between the equator and the pole, and that acts to shift the storms poleward. So it's this battle between ozone recovery and greenhouse gas increases going forward. So it's real, it'll be really dependent on our emission scenarios and how quickly the ozone hole recovers as to which forcing or which scenario will win the battle. So here again I have the Southern Annular Mode Index, which is which measures the strength and the position of the winds in the Southern Ocean. And you can see again at the top I've got the same figure as before. Ozone depletion substances, they drive the SAM index into more of a positive phase, and then as ozone recovers, the SAM declines as well. And as I noted before, this is only really playing a role in the summer season. However, greenhouse gases at the bottom, if we drive the model just with greenhouse gas increases, you can see in the past the Southern Annular Mode Index does increase, but it's much weaker than the ozone depleting substances experiment. So ozone really was the dominant factor in our changes in our circulation over the past few decades. Going forward, greenhouse gases will keep this SAM index trending positive. So at about mid-century, you can see that the ozone depleting SAM index and the greenhouse gases kind of meet, And after about mid-century, greenhouse gases really win the battle and will dominate. It's also important to note that greenhouse gases have effects on our circulation in all seasons, and so there's an important role in winter as well. So this is a really hot bed of research right now that we're trying to really understand the mechanisms of ozone recovery and how that will interact with greenhouse gases in the future going forward. And there's new opportunities to assess the role of these two forcings on our climate and on the Southern Hemisphere atmospheric circulation with new climate model experiments that have been undertaken in preparation for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 5th assessment report. So I'm showing here global average surface temperatures from one of the IPCC models. And you can see a time series of global temperatures from 1850 up to 2300. And these are based on new scenarios of emissions for the future that have been developed in preparation for the IPCC 5th assessment report. So if we just focus on the red line, that's RCP 8.5, so that's a high emissions scenario, and that results in about 4 degrees of warming by the end of the 21st century. Whereas RCP 2.6 is a low emission scenario, and that keeps the temperatures below 2 degrees above pre-industrial. So we're running all these experiments with a number of models, and the good news this time is that all of these models include stratospheric ozone depletion and recovery, which in the previous assessment report they didn't. So it's been a real recognition by the scientific community that ozone is important. There's also in this round of this intercomparison project a number of chemistry climate models participating, and also a number of models that resolve the stratosphere. So there's lots of opportunities to look at this problem. So this is just the change in winds from one of the models, the NCAR CCSM4 model. So here we're looking at the change in the winds, and the colours here are the magnitude of the wind change. For the two emission scenarios I pointed out, the low emissions scenario on the left and the high emissions scenario on the right. And this is the change in the winds from present day at the end of the 21st century. And you can see that if we look on the low emissions scenario, the winds are going the opposite way around Antarctica than they did, than we've seen the observations. And so this is suggesting that ozone recovery wins, that ozone will, when global warming is minimised, is kept low, ozone is the dominant forcing and causes a weak kind of shift of the jet back towards the equator. And that leads to increases in westerly winds over the Australian and New Zealand regions. On the other hand, if you have a high emission scenario on the right, you really get this strengthening of the westerly jet and the shift poleward, and really strong changes in the winds and a real clear positive SAM trend. And that will have big effects on our rainfall and climate over the Southern Hemisphere. So it's clear that ozone recovery will offset the changes in circulation that we're expecting from greenhouse gases to some extent, but it's really dependent on which emissions forcing trajectory we follow. So I guess the main point is that the forcing really does matter, and the emissions pathway that we take does matter. So to conclude, I've shown that the ozone hole has driven much of the observed shift in our atmospheric circulation over the Southern Hemisphere, and has had broad impacts on our surface climate, including changes in the rainfall and temperatures and the winds. And we do expect that going forward, the ozone recovery will offset the expected changes in climate change to some extent. And as I said, this is a real active area of research in the climate community, and there's many papers that have been written recently on understanding this problem. These ties to the tropics and subtropical rainfall are really new and need further exploration. There's lots of work on mechanisms for how all these, how ozone really does influence our climate, and there's also potential impacts on extremes. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.